I am 93, born in Vancouver, British Columbia. Well, the first thing I ever did was in 1934, if you can believe it.
Nice.
I was a student of Denilda Turner, who was a tap dance teacher, and I did her Christmas show, and I tap danced and sang on the Good Ship Lollipop. Well, my parents all were very musical. My mother really was a stage mom. She always wanted to be. She had a wonderful voice, but in those days, her Scottish father said, "You're not going to put any paint and powder on your face." So that was what happened. So Vancouver was very British in those days, and I was born in a Scottish household, basically, and everything was Scottish. So it was when I moved to England, it was very easy to live there. Well, what happened first, I started going to all these festivals as a kid, the Kiwanis Festival and the Eisteddfod, which is a Welsh festival, and ended up eventually winning these ones, and then started taking singing lessons and elocution lessons. And I also worked because this was a depression, so it was pretty tough. I was working for about time I was 15 in summer jobs and Christmas jobs and things just to pay for some of these expensive lessons.
Right.
And then when I was about 18, Sidney Risk, who was one of the very influential persons at the time, had a lot of students and things, and we did plays over a Chinese restaurant. And I think my first job, I was paid $25. We had to clean out the toilets first. That was part of it. And we did plays. And that's where I first started, because in those days, I couldn't afford to go to a school, and there weren't any schools of drama. I just had to learn by doing. Yeah. And my next job that came up, and this was a professional job because I joined Theatre of the Stars when I was 21.
Still exists?
Yes, it still exists. And it's not as professional a company as it once was, but it was very professional at that time. So you had to join Equity. And I was a member of Equity at that time.
And what year was that?
That was 1951.
And tell me about Equity. What was it like then? Was it Canadian Equity?
No, there was no Canadian Equity until about 1958. So I still am I belong to both of those equities because I was originally in Canada with them, and then they accepted it because I'd been a member of American Equity for so long. Yeah.
And what were the rules like then? Like, did you feel protected by Equity back then?
Yes, and I'm rather sorry to say this, but I think we should have stayed there, quite frankly. We got Canadianized and thought we could do it ourselves, and we don't have the power that they have.
Right.
There were lots of things that went wrong that could have been very easily fixed in the 50s when we became Canadian Equity that never were done because they didn't have the power. So I was with them for a couple of years, and wonderful training because we did 8 musicals, and we started off rehearsing the musical, and then we would perform it. We would then do the dress rehearsal at 12 o'clock at night, and then we'd go into about early in the morning, about 4 o'clock. The next day was our day off, and then we started again rehearsing the following Monday or Tuesday the next show that was going to be on. So we were doing about 6 big musicals, not small musicals. Yeah. It was a large company. Most of the people that came were American from New York City, or so of our leads, except for Betty Phillips, who was sort of the Canadian leading lady at that time and was very, very good. And so it was all very professional. Well, basically, I sort of did a little bit of everything, and I have done a bit of everything in my career because at one time, believe it or not, I was the on-camera spokeswoman for TVO for 2 years.
Wow.
So you do whatever you have to do to keep alive. Yeah. So the more things you can do, the better. Oh, yes, it was discovered. My mother was determined I was going to do this professionally. When I was about 15, that's when I started singing lessons.
Oh, okay.
And I studied ever since then. And I studied up until, I still was studying singing until I was up into my 70s. Yeah. I have a favorite teacher right now called Deborah Joy.
Okay.
And it's very interesting. The last show I did was at Kerner Hall I did Follies in that show.
Yeah.
And somehow we developed this voice for this 92-year-old woman that even I had never heard before. I had such power. It was just unbelievable and so simple and loud. And I hate to boast, but I got 3 standing ovations from the 3 people that were there. And it was quite a sensation to see this old lady singing that well. And that worked beautifully for me.
Amazing.
Yeah, like a whole new voice that I'd never had before.
Exactly.
Well, what happened there was I finished with Theatre Under the Stars, and then I went to a group, one of the first paid groups. They were in equity, but they were the first paid group called Totem Theatre. And I got 2 years of training there as their kind of resident ingenue and did all kinds of plays. The first thing I did was Streetcar Named Desire with Bruno Gerussi, who was a very famous actor at the time. Well, that was, he was famous now, but that's...
Yeah, Beachcombers.
I played Stella and he played Stanley.
And what was he like back then?
He was quite fantastic. He was quite randy at the time and full of pep. He's about the only person I've ever met that was able to break down that third wall between himself and an audience.
Yeah.
He had that magic. But he went off to Stratford the first year at Stratford. And he came back, and everybody in Stratford at that particular time, showing you how quiet and demure we were in Vancouver at the time, he kept on using the F word. Yeah. And finally someone said, you can't use that word in the theater. And he said, everybody at Stratford, you may do it there. He says, but you're not going to do it at Totem Theatre. So from there, after I did that, I decided it was time to do something. I had a chance I could do 3 places. I could go to Britain, England, I could go to Hollywood, or I could go to New York.
Why didn't you want to stay in Canada?
Because in Vancouver, as has always been, there is always theatre coming up and theatre going down. And there wasn't enough work. I was working I had to work I was working as a typist for the income tax department. Okay. And I always had a job. I had to work. But the nice thing is, when I started getting gigs and things as a child, not as a child, but in my teenage years, I would just take off because there were lots of people, like filing things for Bell Telephone or something like that. So I would do that, and then I would go off again, and that's how I would.
What was obviously so many actors have to take secondary jobs. Was it because the wages were poor, or just because there wasn't consistent?
There just wasn't enough theatre. There was very little theatre.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that there wasn't much, and most of the people working there were radio people. I made that choice, and I moved to England, and I got a job as a Annie in a touring company of Oklahoma. And that lasted for a while. And then I went down to London and auditioned for a show, and I got it. And it was starring Gillian Lay and Anton Walbrook. Now, if you've ever seen The Red Shoes, Anton Walbrook played the owner of the company. And he was a very famous man at the time. We always called him Mr. Walbrook. And so I worked with them for a while, and then I had a friend who from Vancouver called Billy Petch, who played piano beautifully, and there was a club called the Stork Room in London where everybody who was anybody went, and we did a little show there, sort of a cabaret show that was written, and we would do that every night. So I worked with them, and then we decided that we would get a sort of an act together ourselves. He played beautifully, but only in the key of C.
Okay.
So anyway, we worked there for a while, and the fellow said, "You guys are great." He said, "But why do everything in the key of C?" Well, we had to, we were playing at a very poshy club, and we worked all kinds of clubs, like the Astor Club, where Shirley Bassey started. She and I started at the same time. She became famous, and it was really fun in those days. And then from there, we decided we'd go. My girlfriend and I, we were singing with a 20-piece orchestra at Lyons Corner House, which was a place where people went for afternoon tea and evenings. And we went to Europe, and we traveled around Europe. And then we went one night, we were in Rome, and we went to a club to visit with a girl who was working there. and called the Kit Kat Club. And they said, well, what do you girls do? We said, we sing. And they said, would you like to work here? She's gone. She's gone. She went off with an Arab sheik. It really did. And so that was the end of that. So we started working there. And that again was a club where everybody went. And they were filming War and Peace at the time. So we ended up doing quite a bit of work in War and Peace as well. So
what did you do in War and Peace?
Third balcony to the left kind of thing. But the whole company had wonderful times together. And Hank Fonda was there, and he was very, very nice to everybody. And we had really good times together. And then from there, I went back and I thought, well, I think I've had enough now. We went off to the Middle East. And the group we were with, so we went to Beirut and worked there for a while, and then went off to Damascus and Baghdad and had some rather scary experiences there. So we went back to England, and then I decided I think it's time to go home. So that's what I did. I'd been away for quite a year, about 3 years. So I went back to Vancouver. And no sooner did I get there than they were auditioning for a show called Pick the Stars, which was a new television show. This was for CBC. Well, there was only CBC in those days. That was it.
Okay.
So I auditioned for them, and I was against Paul Anka was in that was auditioned for it, and several other people, but I won from this moment on. It was one of my big ones, and My Bill was another one. Right. He's just my Bill, an ordinary guy. Yeah, did that. And so I won, and my prize was, guess what? Country Hoedown. I was never a country singer. I was one of their leads. Yes.
Amazing.
It's Gordy Tapp and Tommy Common and Tommy Hunter, the Hames sisters, King Ganem and me. And it was very relaxed in those days. You pick up your music on decide what you're going to sing. And of course, thank goodness for Tommy Hunter, because he would help me pick songs, because I knew nothing about country singing at all. And so I would pick a song, and then I'd learn it. And then we'd come back about 2:00 in the afternoon to the studio, and we would start doing a rehearsal. And we just sort of wing it. That's basically, and then an audience would show up, and we play it. And that's, I think, why it was so popular, because there were all kinds of funny things that would happen if you forgot something. Or I remember Gordy Tapp would always say, you couldn't remember the lyrics, you always sing Coming Through the Jam. I don't know why, but that was a hugely popular show. I got 500 letters alone from Newfoundland, because that's all they could get there, I guess, in a lot of places. And a lot of people here, I can walk down the street in Stratford, and people will, if they're old enough, will remember me from Country Hoedown. And so I spent 3 years with them, and then I decided I would change that and go perhaps to do something else. So I went with a show called The Billy O'Connor Show, which was closer to my things, but we did the hit parade. And when I first got down there, when I was still auditioning for the other show or singing with the other show, I did every show there was, because what happened with a lot of things in that time, stars were radio stars. And especially, we had about 15 different half-hour and hour drama shows, which I could also do too, which I did, because they could memorize.
Okay.
So it was very hard for them to memorize. Okay. And so that left a whole new, and there were only about 15 people actually who could do a lot of things in Toronto at that time. So basically, we just did everything there was to do. So I was 55.
In Toronto, yeah.
Yes, in Toronto. There were a lot of people that could do it.
Wow.
And then I had all that experience with club work as well. So I did nightclub work as well.
In Toronto.
In Toronto as well, because we had a lot of places. I sang with the Moxie Whitney Orchestra at the Royal York for one summer there at the big room they had. Used to have these large rooms.
What kind of music would you remember? Any of the material?
It's pop. It's just pop stuff of the time. Yeah. That ended, and then I married, and I went down to Los Angeles. But I always kept coming back, and I did a lot of work in Vancouver in theater there. And so I worked at the Vancouver Playhouse a lot in shows there. And then some things I would come back and do TV shows in Toronto as well. But most of my work was in Canada because it's just too difficult in LA to do anything really when you get around to it, too many people. Unfortunately, we decided I came back to Toronto for a while. I went in 1974 to the Shaw Festival. Paxton was the director there, and it was Charlie's aunt. So that was a whole season.
When did this Shaw Festival start?
They started in 73.
So just you were there the second year.
Yeah. It was
And what was it like then? Like, where was the theater that you performed?
It was a big theater. It was the large theater was built.
That exists?
Yes, it existed then.
Was the Royal George used?
Yes, it was there as well. But we did Charlie's aunt at the large theater because it was a big costume show.
Nice.
And we stayed with them, and then we went to the United States, to Boston with Charlie's aunt for about a month or so. And then that was the end of that, and I came back to Canada. And then it was kind of depressing just to come back after all the excitement of living at the Shaw Festival, being spoiled rotten. Yeah. So I came, another couple of years went by, and then I came back, took my children and came back to Canada in the 60s, 64, 65.
Right.
And started all over again in theater there. And then did go back to the United States. And I think that was about 1980, and I auditioned for Oklahoma, which was Agnes DeMille directed. Yes. And that was just a very fortuitous thing to happen because I had an agent. I hadn't sent me out on anything for 2 years. I just inherited a house through my divorce that I couldn't pay for. I was working in a dinner theater there for about a year before that. And then that sort of ended. And they were looking, somebody decided that they didn't want to understudy Ann Eller, who was Mary Wicks at the time, was in that show. Yeah. And they wanted someone who could play in the chorus, but could also do that role. So I got it. I got that, and we spent about a month, 2 months in LA getting the show up. And then we took it on tour for about 7 months, and then we went to Broadway with it. And they did the original ballet, the original.
So she was the director and choreographer of this female.
Yes.
Right.
So it won Tony that year.
Wow.
Then we went out on tour with that for a while, and then back I come to Canada.
Oh, you came back to Canada after that.
After that,
what drew you back to Canada?
It's my home, Toronto. I knew Toronto, and I knew I probably could work there again. So I started working in summer theater and a lot of things with friends that I knew. I worked in Sudbury quite a bit. And
who was the artistic directors that you worked for?
Ron Ulrich was one of them. I've done so many. I did Waiting for the Parade there and several other shows.
What was it like in 1983 at the Huron Country Playhouse?
It was in an old barn. And it was interesting because it was a barn, and next door was a man who was a pig farmer. We used to have every night, I think he put the pig stuff on there on purpose because he didn't want us next door. You'd have eau de cochon coming through the. After that, they built a balcony, had people in the balcony, so that was good. But on opening night, on the dress rehearsal, a lightning bolt hits the balcony, but luckily everyone was gone by that time. So lots of lightning, and it was a lovely place because you could see in that area, you could see the northern lights. And it was fun. We had bikes and we went into town. We had a little cottage, and I shared with a girl called Renee Buteau, who's not quite a well-known opera singer. And we had a wonderful time. It was really, really great. And then Theatre at Paris, yes, I got that. That was an interesting job. That was one of the Fenario plays, and he was a French-Canadian author. And quite a character. That was in a small theater then, not the theater that's built now. It was in somewhere near the market, in the market part. Wayne Best was the lead in that. That's the first time we worked together.
And you were also at the Globe Theater?
Yes, I went out there and did that was a lovely. We did Oh, What a Lovely War and Measure for Measure. So that was very nice to do as well. And the reason and then after that, I went to Charlottetown, and I was playing smaller roles, not Rachel Lynn at that point. And one of the actors said that fellow that was, I'm trying to think of his name now, was the director at Stephenville, and they were doing Oedipus Rex, and they wanted somebody to play Jocasta. So he said, "You think you think there's somebody there that can act well enough to play Jocasta, look young enough and yet old enough to be your mother, or attractive enough to be your mother?" So he said, "How about Lorraine Foreman?" So he said, "Yeah, okay." He didn't know me, and he took a chance, because at that time, I remember I was on a television show, and they said, "Well, what's it about?" So I said, "Well, it's kind of like Dallas in a way." Well, it was pretty heavy duty stuff, but people came, and it was really lovely. And I had a hostess I stayed with who made sure I tried every delicacy there was in Newfoundland, like moose meat, which is very rich, and cod cheeks, and you name it. Screech. Valdemond hired me to do, I think Mrs. Spencer, I think it was at one point, and then when he left, the Walter learning years came up, and Walter asked me to go back and play Ben Bass's mother, Gladys, in Are You Lonesome Tonight? He played Elvis. And then I did Rachel Lynn as the other show. By that time, I was getting into my probably 50s or 60s, right, with a live end. And I was with them for about 8 or 9 years, which I love, because I love to tour, so it was perfect for me. I'm a tourist, and I'm also a historian. So when I go anywhere, I just love to go somewhere and find out about everything about it. And it was and what I had done when I first went to Los Angeles, I bought a car, my RAV4, 1996, and I traveled all over the touring of the United States. I just drove with that car, because it took almost 3 weeks just to move that set.
So for which show was this?
This was for Showboat, just to move the Showboat set. Right. So you always had time to get from point A to point B. So, and they went all over the place.
Who were you into studying at that point?
Elaine Stritch in that. Yeah. It's an interesting story about Elaine. One time when I first joined the company in Toronto, she said, "I'm hearing some pretty good things about you." She says, "But honey, you'll never get on." She says, "Because they pay me $4,000 a show." Sold out, they're making big money. And Garth was very good to me. He was, I was very happy with it, and working with people I did. And then the nice thing I did, the first show I did with them was Kiss the Spider Woman. Yes. So that was great. We were here for 6 months, and then we went to England for 6 months. So that was great to be in London for 6 months before it went to Broadway. Yes. I was actually supposed to play the mother in that. But at the time, I was working for just a Tapestry Theatre kids show, and I couldn't get into town to audition for Hal Prince, and he didn't want, so I never got to audition for Hal Prince, so he hired somebody else. So then Jeffrey Hurd, who was the musical director, he was very good to me. And he said, "Well, why don't you go down?" He says, "Just go down and let everybody see you in New York City." He said, "You might want to do that." And, well, why not? So I went down and I sang it. And that was one of the nicest things that's ever happened to me. John Kander got up and walked over to me after I'd finished singing and kissed me on the cheek and gave me a big hug. And he said, "That's the most beautifully I've ever heard that song sung." It was Dear One. Which is Dear One, no, I don't think without you. Yeah, it was kind of a hubbub, and then Garth said, "Well," he said, "I guess you got the job if you want it." So I thought, why not? It was very interesting to watch. It's an interesting show because Hal Prince is a wonderful person and a wonderful director, but as an acting director, it's difficult because when you work for him, you have to give your opening night performance as your very first performance, very first rehearsal. So there's nowhere to grow as an actor. And that used to drive a lot of actors that were in the cast completely bananas. Says, where can I go from here? In some other way. That might have been his way of directing.
Like
he wanted, it was really because Brent Carver, who's the whole time he was there, he kept his script by his side.
Oh, really?
Yes.
During rehearsals?
Right up to the very end.
Why do you think he did that?
He knew his script, but he just didn't want Hal to tell him what to do, basically. Yes. And he was so good, you couldn't really, he was always doing something different, even sometimes different words and things. He would try stuff. Yeah. He was great. He was very adventuresome with what he did. He didn't do the same thing twice.
Yeah. And did you ever get to take over the role at all?
Well, this is a big problem. That's why I ended up in Showboat. I was supposed to take over the role in England. Mm-hmm. And in 1958 in England, I belonged to British Equity. They had a fire, and they had nothing. That's before the days of computers, and there was nothing to show that I'd ever been a member of Equity. So as the American cast that went over the Canadian cast, I even had a British passport at that time, but they only were allowing so many people. British people. I just decided. So I had a chat with I said, I think I might. I'll go to New York. So I did go to New York with the show, but when I heard they were casting Showboat, I said to Jeffrey, I said, do you think I could have a try? There's the Irish landlady and a few other things, and also the understudy. And he said, I don't see why not. She said, I'll ask Hal. So I did audition, and I got that, and I came out of the other show. But the show in England didn't last very long. It died. The leading lady who took over Cheetah's role was very, very difficult to deal with. And
you remember who it was?
It was on Fraser. She played the wife of Fraser's wife.
Yeah.
And she was very, very nasty to everyone.
Yeah.
And so it didn't last very long at all.
Right.
So I made the right move, obviously. Then in 1990, after I had left, after I had finished with Charlottetown, I was in town waiting to perhaps do something here, and it didn't pan out. So someone said, well, they're having editions, their last edition. Why don't you go down and see them at Stratford? So I went down and I got into that show. I played the general, and then I did Mary Wise of Windsor as well.
How did you find working with Brian McDonald?
Oh, I loved him.
Okay. How come?
Yeah. He's just he's a wonderful, he lets you do whatever you want to do. I mean, if he'll take you, when you work with Brian, you can collaborate. He doesn't just tell you you're going to do it in that way. He will allow you to do, because I did all kinds of crazy things that nobody has ever done. Yeah. And quite often I'll watch a lot of television. I do, you can borrow from things. On the Jack Benny show, there was a guy there that used to, how wonderful. And all of a sudden, I thought somebody said something when one of the leading men was going to get married or something, whatever the role was that turned out to be the right role, and I had to go around the stage. When he said that, I made a kind of pause that you always do if you're a comedian. Wait for it. And I went, how wonderful. Everybody went, and I said, oh, and then I did this kind of a hitch step. I don't know how I did that. It's just something I know how to do. It's very funny. Did this hitch step around the kick step around the thing. It was like a big kind of scene that got a little bit of applause. And cool. Everybody remembers that one thing. But you have to sometimes when you're doing comedy, steal. You're stealing from people. You also did a tour to Japan with Anne Green Gables and the Charlottetown Festival. Well, that was the following year. Yeah. What was that like? That was really, well, I didn't really, I wanted to do it, but there was another show by Andrew Lloyd Webber, and I can't remember what it was called now, but I was hoping I was going to get into that show, but I didn't get into it. And so I went with, and it was a 3 months tour. And they called, it was Denise Ferguson, trying to think, and another woman, I can't remember her name right now. We were called the Three Dreadnoughts. No shrine is left untouched. So when everybody is doing, sleeping in all night, up all night, we were in bed, and at 8:30 in the morning, we were out of there, and we were on our way to a shrine somewhere by rail or whatever, however we did it. So it was really fantastic. We didn't waste any time. We saw everything there was, and I was a tourist, so this was just, and Denise loves being a tourist too, so we all had a marvelous time. Well, interestingly enough, we did it in English, but on the sidelines it was done on the sides where it was done in Japanese. But for my character, they had her done as a kind of countrywoman. So it got sort of laughs because of the accent that she used for Rachel Lynn. Yeah. But there were some things that they didn't understand. There was a lovely row one point where Rachel Lynn says something and it gets a huge laugh here. But they did, because it's some sort of religious connotation, but they didn't understand it. So it just went, they went crazy. We had a group called what did they call the Butterflies? They were 80,000 strong. They were all over Japan, and they came to every show in practically as many shows as they could. And after the show, they would be there with flowers for us. It got so ridiculous that at one point, just massive bouquets. So when we got to Hiroshima, I had a friend of mine in high school, in grade school, when I lived in the East End of Vancouver, and our junior high school was practically all Japanese at that point. And when they were all sent away, that was pretty. But just before that, one of the friends, Rosie Hamada, her grandmother was in Hiroshima and was not well, so she was sent to keep an eye on her grandma, and she died in the bombing. So I thought that'd be rather nice. So there was a thing for children there at the back of the theater. So we took all our bouquets and put them down and celebrated that way. We went from Tokyo all the way down to there was Yokohama. There was we went to the other island, Fukuoka. Fukuoka is an extra island. There's a little stretch there, and that's the other island.
Do you remember who your Anne and Gilbert were, and your Matthew?
On the tour, it was Lisa Way.
Great.
And Lisa Way and I were introduced many, many years ago when the first year with Walter Learning took us there. I drove my car from Vancouver. I was living in Vancouver at the time, and picked her up in Sudbury, where her home was, and drove her to. So she was very, very young at that time. So we lived together for a year. That was when I decided at that point. It was after that, I thought, I haven't seen anything of the world. Yeah. And I decided each year I would go somewhere. So first year I went to China for a month. Then I went to India for 9 weeks. I did a camel ride, 3 days on a camel in the Thar Desert. These were called, this is Intrepid. It's, they only take about 10 to 15 people. And it's adventure. You carry your own bags, and it's a sort of, one night you stay in a Maharaja's palace, the next night you stay in this dump, kind of thing. But it's wonderful. So I traveled with them there, and then I went to Vietnam, and where else did I go? I took a trip up from Bali all the way up to Flores. I went to see the Komodo dragons and the Nile, and I was on to do that. and just had some wonderful trips.
Very nice.
And then between one of those trips in the 80s, I took my daughter on a trip to Europe. And they did the tour that everybody should take, kind of thing, to introduce her. So she loves to travel too.
Nice.
So I worked for about 8 years with the boys we did a show called Starbright for David Hogan and David Rogers.
All right.
And they're like we also played one night at the big theater in Stratford. Rebecca Poff and Susan Gilmore was in that. It was a lovely cast. Well, I started working for Drayton Theatre. Yes, I started working for them, and that was fun. And even though I sang, I sang in the chorus, but I never sang a role for him. I was always playing the comedic. So it was a comedy lady who was an older comedy lady. So I did Harvey and a whole batch of musicals for him. And every year I would do something, and I ended up finally, when I was 87, my last work for them was to do Sister Act.
Nice.
And wow, I did 6 months of that, and finally I thought 8 shows a week is getting to be a bit much. But I never will retire because I don't really like the idea of retiring. But I'm realizing now sooner or later I'll have to retire. Let's face it, the old brain is not memorizing things. Yeah, but I still can remember all that. I still can do a nightclub act. But that's what's so funny about moving to Stratford. There's so many people I worked with, back in '90. Yeah. They've changed. Yes. They look different. So do I. Yeah. And they'll say, "Hi, oh my God." I said, I like my role in Streetcar Named Desire. That Stella was a lovely role. Yes. There was also I did a thing called Barbara Allen in one of the Totem Theater shows, and I loved working at the Shaw Festival in that show. Oh, come on, Lorraine. What was the show?
It was.
I have a picture of
Charlie's aunt.
Charlie's aunt.
And you played Donna
Lucia. Donna Lucia. Yeah. Okay. I love that role.
So you like that?
I like those kind of roles. There's the British. You see, what happened with my British accent is I took this elocution class when I was about 12.
What would you learn in an elocution?
Well, it's speech, basically, poetry. And reading, actually, it's speech production, and it was attached to the Trinity School. It was a correspondence course I took, and it was associated. So I have some kind of small degree from Trinity College in Dublin with that course that I took on correspondence for 4 years. Her name was Maida Pridmore Brown.
Wow!
And so it took me almost 2 or 3 years on a stage to not speak with a British accent. It's really funny. I was just so steeped in this elocution that everything had to be absolutely perfect. Well, when we went on tour with Charlie's aunt. At one point, it was this very narrow theater and the small theater in Ottawa, and the audience is sort of sitting here, and you're on the stage there. And all of a sudden, I looked around, and one of the flowers above there was a mantelpiece was starting to go on fire. Was going on fire, and I looked at Pax, and then we were talking, and it down. But you could see the people back there were going, "Is that smoke on?" That was a bit scary.
That is scary.
And then we had again in that same show at at Shaw, Mr. Spettigue, his name was, would chase Charlie around and around because he was in love with Charlie. Thought Charlie was a woman, of course. And it was this big chase, and all of a sudden he sat down, and so everybody was sort of standing there while this was going on, and he didn't do anything. And all of a sudden we realized he had died. And so I don't think he just took the curtain and did something so they knew something was going on. I told him theater one time, and I had a laugh line, and it just died. Okay, so the director said to me, he said, "Look at Dorothy." He said, "When you deliver your line, or see what Dorothy's doing when you deliver your line." So I did. So I delivered my line. Dorothy did. That's all it takes. Took the focus off the laugh and put the focus on her.
Wow.
And so he said, "You know now what to do, don't you?" So Dorothy has the comedies. Dorothy had a line. So I just went. She caught me and she never did it again. She knew. Those are actors' tricks.